Unemployment, racism, gender-based violence and an uncertain future beyond the coronavirus pandemic. Just some of the issues facing the youth of South Africa today. So on this Youth Day, we take a look at how young people can rise to their generational challenges. Our guest this morning is Angelo Fick, Director of Research at the Auwal Socio-Economic Research Institute. And Angelo, thanks very much for joining us this morning over our Skype line. And one just gets this feeling that particular to today, the words of Frantz Fanon, they seem so fitting, as we reflect on June 16th, 1976, where he says, each generation must discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. And the feeling, I don't know if you'd agree, is that the youth of today, perhaps their mission is so much broader, so much wider. What's your take?
Good morning, Michelle. I think it is indeed broader and wider than the missions of previous generations to some extent, and also far more urgent because in some respects, all of the issues that you've mentioned are real and have to be addressed. But in addition to those issues is the issue of the climate emergency. So there is the question of equality and inequality, whether it is economic, social, or political, whether it's national or global or regional, whether it's inside a country or whether it is in regions. But across the world, the issue of the climate emergency being visited upon us gives a whole new kind of, shall we say, not angle, but taint and tint to this particular moment in history. Because the young people alive today, people much younger than I am, people under 30, who will live into the second half of this century, are facing a set of challenges partly made by the way in which we've lived over the last 150 years that we'll have to address.
And do you get the sense that young people are taking to the streets like the youth of 1976, or are we trying to do our bit from the comfort of Twitter?
I think for the majority of young people in the world, the kind of Twitter activity that middle class and some privileged young people have is quite a sideshow to their lives. For the millions, if not billions, of young people in protests, in political agitation, in struggling to make a life, not just in South Africa, but across the globe, there is a whole other set of challenges that they have to face, whether it's in India, whether it's in the Horn of Africa with the issues of locusts, whether it is water shortages, or whether it is the kind of racism that South Africans in their millions face, that people in the United States face. People are moving beyond just the social media. So yes, there is a place for social media activism. There is a place for using the internet to get information across that young people are using. But young people are also doing a whole series of very, very difficult tasks inside institutions. We've seen that in South Africa with the Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall movements. We've seen it with the Occupy movement in the United States. And we're seeing it inside the many, many green movements that are happening around the world. And the kind of transnational work that young people are doing with one another is truly source for hope.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right in that many young people are really just trying to, yes, they might be trying to make a change, but they're also really trying to live through some of the challenges that they face. Many of them saying that hunger might get them long before the coronavirus ever does. If we look to East Africa and the locust infestations, as you say, the drought in West Africa, conflict on the rest of the continent, and many, many other issues around the world, as much as young people would want to galvanize, they're really also just trying to make it through.
That, I think, is what they have in common with the 1976 generation. I will never forget Thandi Modise in a documentary describing how she was in school. She was a stellar pupil. She was looking ahead at becoming possibly a medical doctor. And circumstances around her visited themselves upon her in such a way that she just couldn't do that. And in many respects, that's an analogy for young people across the world and in South Africa as well. The COVID-19 challenge has interrupted a whole series of people's plans, but they've also interrupted the system as a whole because it has thrown up the inequality that is unbearable, that many people have been able to ignore. It has thrown up the malfunctioning system that engenders, that creates the kinds of problems that young people are dealing with. And not, again, just in South Africa. This is not to say that June 16th isn't about South Africa. June 16 is a moment in which we now call it Youth Day. For decades, we called it Soweto Day, in which we can reflect on the struggles of the past, the challenges faced by young people, on very, very specific issues in education, and to think critically about the kind of education that will be required to take young people into the second half of this century in a way that will prepare them much better for the challenges that we now know they are going to begin to face in the 2030s. We see similar kinds of issues in Brazil, and this is, again, why this current movement against racism is not as localized as many would have wanted it to be, or as many imagined it is. That the death and killing of George Floyd at the hands of the American police was simply a trigger moment for a whole series of issues that have been simmering there in the Black Atlantic, as Paul Gilroy calls it, for decades, if not centuries. And here is a moment, to use Arundhati Roy's phrase, of imagining a pivotal moment for us to get into another way of living in the world. And perhaps on June 16th, we in South Africa can remind ourselves of what our past struggles have allowed us to do, and to use that energy, some of those methods, and to begin to acknowledge that they will not be enough, and to invent new methods and find new energies to address the kinds of challenges that are coming our way, that are already here, and that we have to address if we're to survive.
Yeah, I think for those of us who have lived through, perhaps not at the same age, but lived through June 16th, 1976, one would have imagined at that time that 44 years later we would have been in a completely different South Africa. And yet here we are. Youth unemployment is a major, major challenge. Even pre-COVID-19, we were talking 38% unemployment rate, most of that young people. That number is set to rise now exponentially in the wake of the pandemic. I mean, this has to be a pivotal moment, doesn't it? This has to be a moment of incredible change, not only in our country, around the world as well, but let's focus on South Africa. How do we ensure that this is that moment that Arundhati Roy talks about?
So I think it's important for us to bear in mind that we're a society that is majority young in its population, and yet the governors of our society are not majority young, if we look at the ages of the people in cabinet. And this is not just a moment in which we have to replace old people with young people, but we must remember that older people have, even people like me, have a very specific view and experience of the world, and that view of and experience of the world is often very interested and invested in our position and our sense of what counts. For the millions of young people in South Africa who are not represented in their age brackets in the institutions of governance in this country, they now have in common with Africans elsewhere on the continent that experience. And here, I think, is that moment where it is important for us who are older to begin to think through and listen to young people, and perhaps at some point step aside. So when it comes to leadership of protests, when it comes to leadership of political change, we who are going to die in the next 15 to 20 years are perhaps not best placed. And this, I think, is a very difficult thing for older people to face. After all, they are, people older than I am, survivors of the 76 incidents, of the 85 emergencies, of the 88 death squads. And so it's very difficult for us to step away from power, but it is going to be absolutely essential for us to help young people by educating them better than we do at the moment. And this is one of the signal failures of post-apartheid South Africa. And to go back to those 70s ideas, it was Steve Biko himself in the 70s who warned us that if you simply change the faces of the people who govern South Africa, but you don't fundamentally transform the economic system of the country, you are likely to see the very same problems of the 70s repeat themselves in that post-apartheid period. And he was no prophet, but he was a very good analyst of his society. And it is almost doubly tragic that we have fulfilled that warning as if it were a prophecy. And here I think it therefore is important for us to begin to think as a society how to help young people by educating them much better than we currently do into science, and not so that they can get jobs, but they can understand the world scientifically, to give them critical literacy so that they can see the problems and problem solve themselves, so that we create an entire generation of people who can look to the world, identify the problems in that world, and engage it far more critically than we were able to, because ironically and tragically, part of the problems that they have to face are created by the system that we invested in, invented in, engendered in order to achieve success. And those systems include the economic system and the ravages that it has visited upon the climate. It includes the inequality, because I think for many people the idea that the inequality is an accident is a very calming idea. It's very helpful to think of it that way. But the inequality was made, actively made every day, by the economic system and by investment in the economic system as if it were a success.
Absolutely. Angelo Fick, that's where we'll leave it. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. It's always a great pleasure talking to you. Angelo Fick is Director of Research at the Auwal Socio-Economic Research Institute, just trying to unpack for us there what it is that is the mission for young people in this year of 2020 as we continue to reflect on June 16th, 1976.